Yo, NIA fam, just Trung today. Bilal is traveling. Jack's still on pat leave. So we wanted to make sure we got you guys something this week. And what we're doing is a solo deep dive that I did on Calvin and Hobbes, the greatest comic ever, or top three, as we'll discuss in the episode. And the creator, Bill Watterson. I started like a solo podcast series this time last year. Never got around to releasing any of the episodes I did. It did about 9 or 10 of them. And so this is a good forcing function just to get me to do it. The podcast is tentatively called Caffeinated Deep Dives. As you all know, I get that caffeine game going. So the whole idea behind that solo podcast is I drink a lot of caffeine, I read one book, and then I hit record for an hour plus. But each one's about 20, 30 hours. It turns out a solo podcast is quite hard. And I think you will enjoy it. Let me know or let us know in the comments or the group chat, the Telegram. And please subscribe to Caffeinated Deep Dives. We have the link in the show notes. And without further ado, here is the episode on Calvin and Hobbes and Bill Watterson. This isn't as hard to understand as people try to make it. By the end of 10 years, I said pretty much everything I'd come to say. It's always better to leave the party early. If I'd rolled along with the strip's popularity and repeated myself for another 5, 10, or 20 years, the people now grieving for Calvin and Hobbes would be cursing newspapers for running tedious, ancient strips like mine instead of acquiring fresher, livelier talent. And I would be agreeing with them. I think some of the reason Calvin and Hobbes still finds an audience today is because I chose not to run the wheels off of it. So that is Bill Watterson, the illustrator and author of, in my opinion, the greatest newspaper comic strip ever, comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes. I'm holding it for the listeners that isn't watching this video, but should subscribe to the YouTube anyway to pump the algo. I'm holding the essential Calvin and Hobbes. So one of the 11 book collections that Bill Watterson has published with his publisher. They've sold 50 million of these. Not this book in particular, but all of his books. So that's pretty crazy. Very impressive. And so this is episode 4 of the podcast. And what makes this one a little bit different than the first 3, which was Apple's iPhone, Trader Joe's brand, and Lululemon's yoga pants, is this is a non-first physical, right? This is not physical. This is an idea. I guess you could say newspaper is physical, but what you mean is art. It's kind of like when you think about ideas, the creative side is now what we'll be exploring. And I think this is very interesting because Bill Watterson is a purist. We'll be talking about how he refused to license Calvin and Hobbes. So I know that if you're an artsy kind of person, you're going to appreciate Bill Watterson. But I kind of went through this cycle where I really appreciated the idea of him as an artist. But by the end of learning about him, which I did through a book called Looking for Calvin and Hobbes, which was written by Nevin Martell, who's a DC food writer. The book provides a lot of the quotes I got from Bill Watterson about his work. He's known as the comic industry's J.D. Salinger. J.D. Salinger was the author of Catcher in the Rye, and he disappeared basically off the face of the earth after Catcher in the Rye in the Rye blew up. So in the same way, Bill Watterson is like his last in-person presentation was in 1990 at Kenyon College, his alma mater. And he doesn't do very many interviews. He did Calvin and Hobbes from 1985 to 1995. Over that span, he did 3,160 strips, which is like 310 strips a year. So almost a daily cadence. And that's all he did in that 10-year period. And the beauty about him as a case study for this idea podcast is that this idea completely took him over. For that 10-year period, he did nothing else. And I think it burnt him out so much that he literally, like he said in that quote, he had nothing else to say. And for all intents and purposes, he's basically never drawn another Calvin and Hobbes strip. He's done a couple runs, but like completely moved on with his life. And it's been almost 30 years. And so between 27 and 37, only thing he ever did was Calvin and Hobbes. And then ever since then, for almost the next 30 years, barely touched it. It's a very interesting story. And let me first tell you about the success of Bill Watterson and Calvin and Hobbes, the comic. And then I'm going to tell you about kind of the thrust of this episode. And it's based on a quote from essayist Jed McKenna. So I'll talk about Jed in a second. Let me tell you about some of the numbers from Bill Watterson. So as mentioned, over 3,000 strips in 10 years, over 50 million books sold. So his collections. He actually has this is a weird marker, but the heaviest book ever on the New York Times bestseller list. It's like this full collection of Calvin and Hobbes. I don't own it. It would take me a lot of marriage capital for me to convince my wife to buy it. Like everything you see here on my bookshelf, like this is what I was able to negotiate in our home right now. It's like, the drill. Once you get married, the amount you can negotiate for your personal stuff, it gets smaller and smaller every day, especially if you have kids. So maybe after this podcast, if she's listening, we'll let her decide if I can get the heavy one. But I bought this one right here for my son. Calvin's 6 years old, the character. My son's in the ballpark of that age. There's actually some adulty stuff in Calvin and Hobbes, which I kind of forgot because I stopped reading it for maybe a decade plus. But whatever, my son, he's mature. He can figure it out. So as mentioned, Bill Watterson also turned down about $500 million worth of licensing, like merchandise, dolls, films, never done any of it. And we're going to talk about the purity of an idea and what happens if money touches it. But he didn't allow any of that to happen. It's a pretty crazy story, actually. But this is the thrust. Okay, I'm going to tell you this Jed McKenna essay, this excerpt. So Jed McKenna is talking about Francis Ford Coppola, the director of Godfather 1 and Godfather 2. Okay, and also the Vietnam War film Apocalypse Now. So for those that don't know Francis Ford Coppola very well, there's a 7-year period where he probably had the greatest run in creative history, at least for a filmmaker. In 1972, he did The Godfather. In 1974, he did Godfather 2 and the film The Conversation. In 1979, he released Apocalypse Now. So that's 7-year run, insane. This is what Jed McKenna said about Francis Ford Coppola and the film Apocalypse Now, which famously had a very difficult filming experience. It's supposed to be done in a couple weeks, I think 6 weeks, but it lasted 250 plus days. Martin Sheen almost died on set. He had a heart attack. They were dealing with the Ferdinand Marcos regime, which was a dictatorship in the Philippines. There was a massive typhoon that I think led to a couple of crew members also. The crew members actually did pass away, unfortunately. And Francis Ford Coppola mortgaged his house and gave up future royalties on The Godfather to finance the making and finishing of Apocalypse Now because of all the delays. But here's what Jed McKenna said about Francis Ford Coppola trying to make the film Apocalypse Now. Jed writes, "Be careful what you wish for, not because you'll get it, but because you'll be turned into the thing that can get it. It's not a process where you just ask for something and it magically appears. It's a process that breaks you down and rebuilds you into tool for the job." So all the struggles and difficulties that Francis Ford Coppola went through to make Apocalypse Now, he wanted to do it. But what happens is when you allow an idea, especially in the creative field, well, in any field, really, I mean, this applies to entrepreneurship. You see entrepreneurs Elon's the best example, right? Like sleeping on the floors of his factories. It's because once you have this idea and you convince yourself that, and you choose to pursue an idea, it will turn you into the tool to become that. And I think that's what happened to Bill Watterson. Like from a young age, he wanted to be a cartoonist, a comic strip writer. And he did it for 10 years. But that's all he did. He became a tool and he got worn down. So I want you to remember that Jed McKenna quote. We'll return to it at the end of the episode. But now we're going to get into the story of Calvin and Hobbes and Bill Watterson. We'll talk a bit about his childhood. We'll learn about this newspaper comic syndication industry. It's quite interesting. We'll learn about Bill Watterson and his syndicate when they try to license his material for merch, why he said no and the struggle they went through on that. We'll talk a bit about his creative process, which is always interesting, how to get ideas into the world, because I think a lot of listeners probably write or do something creative for a living, and you'll probably see a lot of what he's doing, and you understand, like, a lot of it's not sexy, right? It's just sitting in front of a table and a piece of paper, like, for hours until something comes out. And then the last part in the awards section, I kind of want to talk about, what is the right of an artist or somebody that creates something in the world to what is their responsibility once they've created something successful? Is that thing enough? And there's some very interesting conversations to be had around Calvin and Hobbes, Bill Watterson, maybe comparisons with Charles Schultz, the Peanuts artist, Jim Davis from Garfield. I mean, this is like the Mount Rushmore of comics. My laptop right now is actually on a triple stack of Gary Larson's Far Side comics, because I can't even, again, my wife restricts the amount of stuff I can put in the home. So like these comics she allowed, but now they serve a dual purpose of lifting my laptop so I look like this on the screen. For the listeners not seeing, like I look like pretty squared on this YouTube video, but it's because I have these Far Side things stacked up. All right, so let's talk about Bill Watterson's life. He was born in 1959. His mother, Catherine, and his father, James. His father was a patent examiner for the Department of Commerce. Bill Watterson has a brother that's a year younger. When they're 6 years old, they moved from Alexandria, I think Alexandria, was that Virginia, to Chagrin Falls, Ohio, a very suburban area outside of Cleveland. So the interesting thing about Ohio is there's actually a rich artistic legacy there when it comes to cartooning. So I don't know the names here that well, but Milton Carniff, who did Terry and the Pirates, Kathy Giswhite, who did Kathy, I know that strip, and Winsor McKay, who did Little Nemo. So from a young age, and this is something we've seen from similar stories with Lululemon and Chip Wilson in the past episode, and 2 episodes before we had Joe Kalum and Trader Joe's, is the idea that the world knows these individuals for, like they're percolating in their heads for decades, right? Like Chip Wilson's idea for performative female athletic wear, I mean, that started 20, 30 years before the creation of Lululemon, maybe 20 years. Joe Kalum and Trader Joe's brand, he was in the retail industry for 2 decades before launching, specifically Trader Joe's, maybe 15 to 20 years. So from a very young age, Bill Watterson wanted to do cartooning. Like his inspiration was actually Peanuts, Charlie Brown and Snoopy from Charles Schultz. I think his father got him that book around age 5 or 6. I couldn't confirm here in these notes, but I know at a young age, he's actually also one of his friends that was interviewed in Nevin Martell's book said that he was a popular kid at school. Bill was, because he could cartoon and draw. So like his skill was there from a young age, or the not the skill necessarily, but the desire and the potential and the interest in cartooning. So many years later, Bill Watterson said this about becoming an artist: I want to be either a cartoonist or an astronaut. The latter was never much of a possibility, as I don't even like riding elevators. So the idea for him, and remember, I mentioned earlier, the first Calvin and Hobbes was published when he's 27 years old, the first comic strip. So this is probably a 20-year journey for him. And we're going to see the struggle that he went through. So he lives in the suburbs of Cleveland, pretty undescript, a quiet life. He goes to a Kenyon college. Kenyon has some interesting alum, actually. So Bill Watterson went to Kenyon College because he thought his way to comic stripping or cartooning, and I'm sure a lot of you are similarly go through these journeys where you think you want to do something, so you do stepping stones. So for Bill Watterson, he's like, if I go to Kenyon College, they have a good poli-sci, political science program. That'll get me a job as a political cartoonist in newspapers, because in the 70s and 80s, that was a thing. Political cartooning was quite a big thing. And Kenyon actually was interesting. They have some interesting alumni. Is Rutherford B. Hayes, former president of the United States. And then they also had a prime minister of Sweden, Olof Palme. Paul Newman was also a graduate of Kenyon College, but the political science program was apparently quite good. And there's something interesting about Bill Watterson at Kenyon College also, is that there was another student there called Jim Borgman. Jim Borgman basically did the template that Bill Watterson would follow. Jim is a cartoonist, a pretty successful one too, or he would become one. And he went to work for the Cincinnati Enquirer and created the cartoon called Zits. Now, what this taught Bill, knowing Jim, was this is what Bill said: anyone can make money drawing cartoons. And the second lesson I learned from Jim Borgman was that he was close to ground zero and someone who'd actually done it. So just to describe what the quote there, which I didn't really give great context for, was like, Bill was like, okay, went to Kenyon College for poli-sci, but the real thing that encouraged him to keep going down this route was he saw Jim Borgman basically do this career. He created a comic strip, went political cartooning. And it's interesting because I think a lot of creative work is that sometimes the word is a milieu. I think it's a French word. I'm butchering it, but it's just the idea of like, you're in and around people pursuing similar things, and it gives you an idea of what you can do. And as we mentioned with Jed McKenna's writing about Francis Ford Coppola, well, Francis Ford Coppola was part of a young director's crew. Like he's friends with Martin Scorsese. He's friends with George Lucas. He's friends with Steven Spielberg. Like these guys all came up together. So you come up with this network, and when you have these small network, these ideas, you get to see these ideas turn into reality through your friends. And that just encourages you more to do it, right? It's like Paris in the 1920s. You had Scott Fitzgerald was living there. Ernest Hemingway was living there. Like you push and challenge each other. So I think in the creative industry, it's very common to see individuals sharing the similar milieu, right? Think about like West Coast hip hop, like a Death Row Records, Snoop, Tupac, Dre. You come up together, you watch people bring their ideas into reality, and you're like, oh, I can do that too. But again, as Jim McKenna's quote says, like, be careful what you make as your idols or inspiration, because you will become a tool for that. But like Bill Watterson saw Jim and like, oh, I can follow Jim Borgman's route. And this took him to that 10-year process of Calvin and Hobbes, where it just completely took him over. So Bill tried to follow the same route. He also got hired by a newspaper in Ohio. I think it's Cincinnati. It's called The Post. And he completely failed as a political cartoonist for a number of reasons. He says that, A, he knew nothing about local politics, which is what he's supposed to political cartoon about. And he didn't know anything about national politics either, right? Is like, what's funny is I basically thought about taking poli-sci as an undergraduate, but all these liberal arts degrees, like I'm a history major, you do it because you have no idea what you want to do in life, right? And like, even if you come out of university with a political science degree, you still know nothing about political science, right? It's all theory. So he's thrust into this world where he's probably studying about Marx and capitalism and communism. And then they're asking him, hey, can you do cartoons about local politics in Cincinnati? He has no idea. So he gets fired by the Post. So Bill Watterson, remember, early 20s. He's 20 years-ish from when he was a child wanting to go in this political cartooning career. He clearly has skill, but he hasn't found the right outlet for it, but he doesn't give up. But this idea is still percolating in his mind. And he isn't able to put his full body into it because he hasn't aligned the money-making aspect, like providing for himself and his wife, and to make it the same as his labor. So after he gets fired from the Post, he does, I don't even know what this job is. He does layouts of ads for a weekly publication. All right, people, I'm dating myself so far. Like, this is the mid-'80s, which basically when I was born. We live in the internet age now. He's laying out ads in newspapers and magazines, it sounds like. But this is what he says about that job. He hated it, which, listen, I can 100% relate to. My first job out of university was as a construction worker. I thought I was hot shit with a history degree from McGill University. It turns out nobody cares that I had a history degree from McGill, right? And nor should they. And I did zero career fairing or thinking about what I wanted to do after school. But I ended up doing construction for my first job was construction. Did it for a couple months. But I won't even say I hate that job. My job after construction was worse. I was a underwriter trainee for an insurance company. I'm sure we'll talk about that in the future, but this is what Bill Watterson said about his ad placing job, which reminds me of my underwriter trainee job at the insurance company. He goes, a real job is a job you hate. I designed car ads and grocery ads in the windowless basements of a convenience store, and I hated every single minute of the 4.5 million minutes I worked there. So sounds like he spent a couple of years there. But again, this idea that he wanted to bring to life decades in the making. And I'm sure there's a lot of you that are listening is like, there's something that you've been noodling on. Oh, I've wanted to do X. Oh, I've wanted to do Y. And it's just still sitting there. You just have to find an outlet where you can actually allow yourself to become the tool for that idea. And again, be careful what it is that you choose and want. And if it is truly what you choose and want, because the mind has a way of turning you into that tool. For example, I've turned myself into a tool for making really dumb memes on Twitter or X. And I think about it a lot, probably way more than I should. But that is kind of the site that I set for myself a couple of years ago. And I've been fashioned into that. I should probably find other inspirations at this point. This podcast is one of them, actually, is trying to deliver more value for my audience and my fans, if I have any. I know I get some email from you guys. Listen, if you can rate this podcast, if you're in episode 4 here, just give me a rating, okay? Anyways, Bill Watterson, while working at this ad job that he hated, was still trying to get into the comic strip game. And he was submitting comics to various newspapers. He's getting $25 a comic. But it was not super successful. When he was 25, he got married, and his job was as a layout artist. So in his mind, that was pretty grim. But finally, he was able to get traction on pitching ideas for Calvin and Hobbes. And there's this idea of it's called the idea maze in startups and entrepreneurship. The idea maze is you think you want to do something, let's say, call it sell shoes online. But then as you work through that initial idea, you find that selling shoes online isn't actually the best idea. It's like selling the insoles or building like a running newsletter for hardcore runners, and then you sell ads and affiliates through that newsletter because you're able to build an audience, and then you make money from that. Like, I'm just a hypothetical of showing what happens with an idea maze. You start with one idea, but then you end up going into maybe a tangential one, or I guess big business pivots have done this, like Netflix going from like sending DVDs by mail to going full streaming. That's kind of like the idea maze. But like in creative work, there's obviously an idea maze, right? Like you're thinking about, hey, here's a comic strip idea I have, and then you keep working on it and refining it. So Bill was pitching various ideas. Like he was pitching a comic strip about a reporter and his editor. That didn't go anywhere. He pitched a comic strip about some critters, like a family of critters. That didn't go anywhere. He started circling what would become Calvin and Hobbes. It was like the name of this a cartoon that he did was called Mucus and Fester. And one of the characters was a stuffed doll. For people that don't know Calvin and Hobbes very well, it's about 6-year-old Calvin, this rambunctious, like really independent-minded child, and his toy doll, which is a tiger. But the conceit, and we'll talk about it, is that the doll to him is real, but his parents and his friends and his teachers don't think that this doll is real. It's actually a really genius idea that allows Bill Watterson to explore some of the comic strips that he pitched, right? These creature worlds. He pitched an idea for a space man called, in Calvin and Hobbes, it turns into Spaceman Spiff. So the name of Calvin and Hobbes, so let's just say he went through the idea maze and ended up with Calvin and Hobbes. What's interesting is that he was rejected so often, but Bill Watterson said this about the rejections. I'm honestly grateful that all my early strip submissions were flatly rejected. This was not a case of a syndicate editor failing to recognize latent genius. My strips had serious flaws, so I'm very lucky I didn't get stuck trying to make one of them fly. So in this idea of ideas and how they come to life, like this reminds me of actually the very first podcast of the series, the iPhone. If you haven't listened to the episode, when Steve Jobs and Apple were developing the iPhone, they went through a full idea maze. And they're kind of similar to what Bill Watterson said here with his initial pitches. They just weren't the right thing. You had to work through them. The initial iPhone, or the Steve Jobs set out 2 teams to create iPhone. One team was just taking the iPod with like that circular wheel and turning that into a phone. And then the other team was taking multi-touch screen technology, which is what we know today. And that team went off and created what ultimately got commercialized as the iPhone. And that was kind of like the idea maze for the iPhone. So Bill Watterson's going through his idea maze and ended up with Calvin and Hobbes, this 6-year-old, really independently minded kid, and his doll, the tiger. So the name Calvin and Hobbes, so Calvin is supposed to refer to the 16th century Protestant theologian. I don't know if you're familiar with the Protestant ethic, is what Calvin had written. It's about, I'm not going to get into it. Well, I'm actually going to do an episode about the Protestant ethic, but it's about how Protestantism and capitalism are very closely intertwined. And then Hobbes, the tiger doll, is a reference, obviously, to the philosopher who said life is nasty, brutish, and short. But it turns out that Calvin was actually just a coincidence, the name. But Hobbes actually was meant to be a reference to the philosopher. But something interesting, and this is more on the creative side of just creativity, writing, filmmaking, I guess any type of artistry. When Bill Watterson said that his editor said there's a lot of problems with his strips, it probably said there wasn't enough personality or it feels forced. Because you have to remember the medium of a comic strip, right? It's 3 panels. Think about a newspaper. You get that one page, and there's maybe 5 to 10 comic strips on that page, and that is a zero-sum game. If you get into the comic funny pages in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, obviously the internet has completely changed that. It's very difficult to get in, and if you're a superstar there, it's very difficult to be dislodged. So it's like, we're going to talk about that industry in a bit, but here's what Bill Watterson said about character writing. He said he knew that a successful strip meant that the characters had to write themselves. And Calvin's actually not based on Bill. What he says is that Calvin is based on things that Bill thinks about. So Calvin talks about space, science, horror movies, art critiques, cars. These are things that Bill is interested in, but Calvin's reactions to them are not Bill at all. Inspiration for Hobbes is kind of actually like Snoopy from the Peanuts comic book. So Charlie Brown has some parallels to Calvin, which Bill Watterson admittedly says he borrows that template. He loves Charles Schulz, actually, Bill Watterson. And actually, the collection I'm holding up here, the Essential Calvin and Hobbes, the back of it has a quote from, the forward is from Charles Schulz. Charles Schulz actually gives a pretty lukewarm embrace of the work, but maybe, I don't know if this is a comic book or comic strip thing, but this is what Charles Schulz wrote about Bill Watterson on the forward for this collection. Calvin and Hobbes contains hilarious pictures that cannot be duplicated in any other medium. In short, it is fun to look at, and this is what makes Bill's work such an admirable success. That sounds pretty lukewarm to me, but Charles is the biggest hitter. He's probably the GOAT comic book guy. Like, it sounds like to me, he sounds like he's the Jordan and like Bill Watterson's the LeBron. But having said that, the characters that are very similar in Calvin and Hobbes, the most similar is the dad. So Bill Watterson says that any of the comic strips where his dad talks about building character, whether that means Calvin's outside freezing or he's tired from homework, that's actually very similar to Bill Watterson's father. And then Hobbes, in addition to some similarities to Tigger from Winnie the Pooh, but also some similarities to Snoopy. Snoopy brought this surreal aspect to Peanuts, but Bill Watterson didn't want too surreal of an aspect, in the sense of like Snoopy is pretty goofy. The last thing I'll say about Calvin versus Charlie Brown is, man, Charlie Brown is like the most depressed, like anxious kid ever. Calvin is not like that. He's like I'm having a Red Bull right now. Calvin seems like perma Red Bull. And then I mentioned it earlier, but part of this comic strip that made it quite successful was the idea that Calvin saw Hobbes as real, whereas everybody else saw it as a doll. So it's actually quite trippy in reading the comic, but it allows for a lot of creative freedom. And like my son is obsessed with like the fake science fiction-y parts of Calvin. So like there's a strip where Calvin pretends to turn into a giant and like stomp on cars and terrorize a village. But then what his mom is seeing is that he's just destroying his toys. So my son, who has a wild imagination, and I can tell he has a wild imagination, the story he's telling me, he can relate to this. I mean, so that's like that's the beauty about Calvin and Hobbes and how it can reach different generations. But here's what Bill Watterson said about Peanuts creator Charles Schulz. Charles Schulz is in a league of his own. Watterson wrote in an essay for the LA Times in 1999. He was a hero to me as a kid, and this influenced my work and life is long and deep. And then he's speaking about some of the influences of the strip. So this is a bit of comic strip history. Charles Schulz gave up virtually all the cinematic devices that create visual drama. There are no fancy perspectives, no interesting croppings, and no shadows and lighting, no 3D modeling, and few props and few settings. Each of the strips is distilled to its barest essence, and it's about the characters. So Bill Watterson, for anybody that's a fan of Calvin and Hobbes, great at character building. Like, the characters feel alive, and when he says it writes itself, like, I feel like I know Calvin and like how he'll react to a situation. So now we're going to talk about the syndication process and return to an idea of actually from the first podcast. When we were talking about the iPhone, Steve Jobs and Sir Jony Ive, the design chief at Apple, they have this quote that I love so much, and it was kind of the inspiration for this entire podcast. They say ideas are fragile. If you tell somebody an idea about anything, it could be anything, it could be a book, a business, that person, say it's your brother, your wife, or your friend, there's a million reasons they can tell you that it will fail. And most of us default to cynicism, and they will tell you why it will fail. Seriously, go and tell somebody about a business idea right now, or after you listen to this podcast, just text them. It's like, hey, I'm thinking about doing an online shop selling sandals. Like, let's go back to the sandal example. They will probably, the gut instinct will be, the response will be something to this line from your friend or your significant other or your family member. They're going to say something nice like, oh, interesting idea. But are you sure like there aren't a lot online already? Like, is that like a profitable idea? It sounds like there's a lot of people already doing that. Like, people's initial instinct is just to shit on ideas. Granted, a lot of ideas are shit and should be shit on, but that's why ideas are fragile. And the syndication process is interesting and during this period because, you know, in the 80s, 90s, media has so many gatekeepers, right? Whether it was newspapers, because newspapers have a local monopoly because they have literally print the newspaper and have the vans driving the newspapers to the homes, right? They control the distribution. Or in Hollywood, it's the studios that control there's a bottleneck. They're the gatekeepers because if you want people to see something, they're going to go to theaters. Well, who has a relationship with the theaters and who can create that 2-hour film that the theaters will want? Obviously, internet age has completely changed all that. But it's interesting because you still need editors in the internet age. There's so many people, so you need curators now, right? But in the syndication process, for those who don't understand, syndicates are these organizations that match basically comic writers and illustrators with newspapers. You know, thousands of newspapers in the world. I think Calvin and Hobbes at its peak was syndicating over 2,500 newspapers. So the syndicate matches the comic book to the newspaper and gets them printed. And that's a relationship. But there's editors in syndicates. And, you know, editors have their role. Like, I've worked with editors. Like, they are people that kind of nurture these ideas. Because sometimes the creator of an idea, they're so focused on creating an idea, they don't actually know how to take it to market, right? They can't sell. And they need someone that can understand that ideas are fragile. I mean, this is like Steve Jobs was known as an editor. He was like not an actual technician or engineer himself, but he could nurture ideas, edit them, and take them to market, protect them until they're ready. So I'll give you a bit of idea about the syndication process. And remember, ideas are very fragile, and you'll see how hard it is to get ideas into something like a newspaper. So in the 1980s, a single newspaper might get 5,000 submissions a year to get on the funny pages. Remember, the funny pages is one page, maybe 10 strips. That is like minimum real estate. And the guys that do well, guys like Jim Davis for Garfield, Charles Schulz for Peanuts, Gary Larson for Far Side, Scott Adams for Dilbert, they hold down those sections. So maybe half of that page is available to even break into. Now, if you're a comic strip writer and you're trying to get in, this is the process. It's a very low-paying job. So you remember, and Bill Watterson, while he's working the ad job, he's submitting comics for 25 bucks a pop. Like, it's not a lot of money. So let's say you get a syndicate deal, though. And remember, syndicates say no to most people. So Nevin Martell, who wrote the book that I'm referencing, said that one syndicate editor told him most of the submissions are shit. So let's say you're going through the process. You send it to the syndicate, you sign an artist development deal, and you might get paid a little bit for 1 month of strips. So if you get 1 month of strips, which, mind you, it might take you years to even get the syndicate to ask you to do 1 month of strips. Let's say that works out and that the newspapers, you get some traction. So here's the economics. This is from the book, Looking for Calvin and Hobbes. When cartoonists are just starting out, they get a minuscule guarantee from the syndicate of probably only a few $100s a week. After the syndicate breaks even on that guarantee, ensuing profits are split 50-50 between the artist and the syndicate. Cartoonists on the low end make 25 grand or less a year. So Nevin Martel's book was written in 2009. Let's say inflation adjusted. You might make 50 grand a year. I mean, this is like, you were talking 2023 now. The comic book industry is like basically toast, right? Outside of the big boys, like I mentioned, Jim Davis, Garfield, Gary Larson, The Far Side, Charles Schultz, who passed away in early 2000, but Peanuts is still going. So a lot of syndicates turned down Bill Watterson. The editors just didn't see it. And mind you, what Bill said earlier, he doesn't even fault them. It's like United, which was a syndicate that owned Peanuts and Garfield, turned down Calvin and Hobbes. And this is what Bill Watterson has said about United. I'm not interested in slamming United. Keep in mind at the time, it was the only syndicate that had expressed any interest in my work. I remain grateful for the early attention. So he learned the pain of doing so. He actually said one of the lessons, it took him 5 years of submitting comics to finally get in with the syndicate called Universal Press. He said what he learned from that period. And I think this is something that many of you listeners can relate to. If you actually truly are meant to pursue an idea and it won't let you go, you're going to be doing that idea regardless of the money. It's like cliche of like, would you do it with or without the money? But this was literally what Bill Watterson was doing. So not only did he want to be a cartoon comic artist from 5, 6, 7 years old and pursued it for 20 years until he really truly broke through. That idea, he would do it for free, and he did. So going back to this Jed McKenna idea of your notion of you becoming a tool once you commit to an idea, this is what I mean. Is like maybe when you're going through the idea maze of pursuing what it is you want to do, the fact that you will do for free and you have done it for free is telling you that this is something that I unconsciously want. And that this unconscious want and need can actually get me through the hard times. Push me through this 5 years in Bill Watterson's case of people telling me no. And even though you are talented, and the fact is being talented isn't enough, right? You need to sell. You need to be the right place, right time. There's a lot of luck involved in life. But knowing what can push you through and what you'll be willing to put up with is, I think you'll find that. And we saw with Bill, it's like that 5 year period where he was actively trying to break in and he couldn't until he met Universal Press, which I'll talk about now. So Lee Salem was working at Universal Press Syndicate. He saw Bill's work, thought it was had potential, showed it to his kids. His kids said, "Oh, this is like Doonesbury for kids." Doonesbury is a really famous political cartoon, a comic newspaper strip. So Bill finally breaks in. And he gets traction because his comic is a fresh breath of air. Remember, he said these comics write themselves. And he's got an endless source of content because he's just expressing his interest through Calvin. And then he gets to do the is Hobbes real or is Hobbes not real shtick. He gets to play on the family component. It's Calvin and his two parents. He gets to play on all these sci-fi elements because remember, Calvin has a wild imagination. And Bill's an extremely good artist. So he's drawing these dinosaur worlds, these space sci-fi action scenes. Great comic. So pretty soon he breaks in and the idea of, I mentioned earlier of how now Bill's turned into a tool to bring Calvin and Hobbes into the world. And he truly is, because him and his wife moved to Hudson, Ohio, from which is a very small town. They moved there in 1986. So about a year into him finally breaking into the comic strip industry. So he's gotten to about 900 newspapers now via the Universal Press Syndicate. And he has to move himself because he doesn't want distractions. And for the next 10 years, he spends basically 15 hours a day thinking, drawing Calvin and Hobbes. His wife, his partner, builds a life around him to allow him to do this. And I mean, there's parts of this story which are pretty sad in the sense of like, Bill becomes very recluse. He is so artistically minded, hates the idea of licensing so much, cares so much about the purity of the art that he kind of has falling outs with other people in the comic book industry or the newspaper comic industry, the cartooning industry, because he's seeing them license stuff. And he gives us like this really, I call it acerbic. I don't know if that acerbic, like acidic speech. I think this is separate from his Kenyon College alumni speech that we talked about, commencement. He did that in 1990. So about 5 years in his career, early 30s at the time. But he gives another speech where he just slams other comic strip writers for taking the money and like kind of alienates himself from the community. And I'll talk about it now, actually, the creative process that he goes through and why Bill Watterson. I think this will split people. You'll see perhaps a bit of yourself in him if you're in the creative field. You'll be like, oh, I love the art. I love the craft of whatever pursuit you're doing. And there's some people being like, well, you have to be more flexible, right? It can't just be about the craft. It has to be about the selling. And there's the livelihood of making money. So this is like, the note I have here is called creative process, but I'm going to talk through some ideas that I wrote down. So Bill Watterson at a commencement speech in 1990, and this is what he said about drawing comic strips. He said that when you start doing it for the money, as in the licensing aspect of your IP for dolls, for merchandise, for pens, what happens is it starts bringing too many cooks in the kitchen. So it takes away from the purity of the art, right? If you're licensing stuff, you are by nature being influenced by the people that want certain merchandise. So you might draw a comic character that could sell well as a doll. So what I didn't mention actually earlier as part of Bill Watterson's idea maze was that one of the syndicates that he had pitched had asked him to actually create something called Robot Man. He was given a chance to do cartooning, but they said the purpose they wanted Robot Man is they wanted to sell Robot Man toys. And Bill's like, no, I'm not doing that. That's no longer for the art. I'm not drawing a Robot Man so he can sell toys. So he actually turned down an opportunity because of this purity. So that's why he's kind of against the money aspect. And we're going to get more into that. But here's a bit about his creative process. He says, getting ideas is the painful part. The drawing is the fun part. He said it would take him 3 to 6 hours to get an idea and then three to 6 hours to draw it. And so that's about 12 hours right there, right? And this is every day essentially for 10 years. He did take some sabbaticals, which we'll talk about. This is part of his argument with the licensing deals with his syndicate. But he said that the idea acquisition part, so he read a ton of newspapers, read a ton of magazines every day, was a difficult part. And I've actually, Rick Rubin, the super producer, has a great podcast. So Rick Rubin has produced the entire gamut of music artists. He's done Run DMC. He's done Johnny Cash. He's done Adele, like every one of the greatest producers ever. But his podcast is great. He has a podcast episode with John Mayer, and him and John Mayer discuss something very interesting, actually. So John Mayer says that he'll be in the studio with his friends jamming, and then they might hit on an idea. And when they realize that there's a seed of an idea there, John Mayer describes it. It's like time to put in your sweatpants, go into a dark room, and work for the next 72 hours. This kind of sounds like what Bill Watterson is describing. It's like, you're trying to find the idea, but once you find it, he describes the drawing part as the fun part. I kind of see similar. When I'm writing an article or a story, and I finally realize the contours of what it is I want to write, my body gets turned into a tool to create that thing. So I think that's kind of what's happening with Bill here. Is like he'll spend 3 to 6 hours getting a good idea, and then his body and mind is going to be turned into a tool to create that output. So a bit more in his content process. He says, I spent hours in my room just leafing through magazines and newspapers looking for a good analogy. Then I play around with it. Sometimes it's very difficult. Sometimes it comes naturally. He says, Bill says, I don't just want to illustrate a situation. Anyone can do that. I want to make a definitive statement in a fair and humorous way. I think that's my best cartoons. That's how they're achieved. And you have to remember, this comic strip stuff, like by hand, right? And it's all he was doing. There's no Photoshop. There's no email. He's submitting this to the syndicate editors by mail. And if there needs to be an edit created, they're saying, oh, you can't say XYZ. They have to call him and he has to redraw the whole thing. So this is what I mean when it's taking like 15 to 18 hours a day. Like that first 12 hours doesn't even count the submitting of it. So important part of his wife is an important part of this process. So shout out to Bill Watterson's wife. She's the first person to see these things and she gives him feedback. And this is a very good quote about Bill Watterson. So he'll go through this process, work 12-hour days. Sometimes he'll throw ideas away. There is no shortcut to bringing ideas into this world. You have to go through the idea maze. You have to put in the work. Bill said sometimes it'll come slowly, sometimes it'll just come quickly. But the whole point is you have to put in the work. And this is what he says. There are no shortcuts. This is his quote. The quality of the strip is determined by the quantity of ideas in the wastebasket. So he's just going through ideas, tossing out the bad ones. Every day, grinding through this idea maze. And even just getting that initial idea of Calvin and Hobbes, you got to throw out a lot of bad ideas. So I'm going to say that quote again. The quality of a strip is determined by the quantity of ideas in the wastebasket. And what's interesting is one of his friends, or somebody in the industry, said this about Bill Watterson. He always underestimated his talents, and he was never entirely convinced that he was good. So Bill doubted himself. Think about this. The greatest comic guy ever. I mean, I think this is something that you'll find with a lot of great entrepreneurs, great artists, is like they have chips. There's always that inkling that they're not good enough. And this is what pushes Bill to work 15 hours a day. And, maybe that's not for everyone, but that's what pushed him to get to where he got. And another interesting thing that he wrote about is that he did not like being up against deadlines. He said that a deadline, if you're up against a deadline, there's no quality control. And I used to write for the Hustle newsletter, which is about 2 million readers, tech and business. It was 5 days a week. I wrote that almost by myself. I had editors, did great work, but like for about a year, I wrote that. And mind you, Bill did this for 10 years without internet, right? Couldn't email just people, couldn't just edit in a Google Doc. But that 1 year I remember that feeling of being up on deadline. And he's right. It's like, if you're writing against a deadline, there's two facts. It's like it pushes you to get it done, but the quality can also be lost. And so he tried to really backlog a lot of work, which is quite difficult to do. And then he added these Sunday strips, he got to a point where he was so good, he got the whole page in the newspaper. And those Sunday strips were multiple panels, 9, 10 panels, sometimes colored. But this is what he pushed himself to. And so that's a bit of the creative process. The next thing we're going to talk about is the licensing process. And what you have to understand about licensing is that licensing is where comic strip writers make most of their money. So what's interesting about the late 80s, the mid 80s, when Bill Watterson was coming up, was if you went on the Forbes list of the highest paid entertainers and media people, two of those people in the late 80s and through the 90s, and probably still today, to be honest, was Charles Schultz from Peanuts and Jim Davis from Garfield. Because these two license their products like crazy. Do you remember Snoopy, the balloon, the MetLife balloon for all these big football games? Garfield has done merchandise licensing for everything. Pens, kitchen magnets, refrigerator magnets, calendars, toys, pillows, blankets. Garfield does $750 million a year in licensed materials. And they're able to do that because Jim Davis was reaching up to 250 million people a day with his comic strip. Charles Schulz was making personally, the Peanuts merch was doing $1 billion a year. He was making about 50 mil. Jim Davis was making about 50 mil from Garfield merchandise. So the main revenue streams for the top artists is a licensing. So they get about 5 to 10% of the wholesale. The other two streams, which is much less of their pies, is you get fees from the newspapers for being in the, you get a comic strip fee for being in the newspapers, and then you split royalties on the books. Like, again, I'm holding up this collection of the Essential Calvin and Hobbes, but there's collections for all these artists, right? It's like I used to have all the Garfields. You get 50-50 split, but that's not where the moneymaker is. Licensing is where the money is made. So we're talking Garfield doing $750 million a year in Garfield merch. Peanuts doing $1 billion a year in Snoopy, Charlie Brown merch. This isn't even mentioned the other types of media, television and film. So licensing was so lucrative. And the interesting thing about Jim Davis and Garfield is 3 years into Garfield comic stripping, he created something called Paul's Ink just for licensing. So Bill Watterson had this opportunity. Calvin and Hobbes got that big. Lifetime has sold 50 million books, was in 2,500 newspaper. He refused to license for anything. The only thing that ever got licensed was a 18-month calendar. And this is for, I believe, 1988, 1989. So Universal Press, the syndicate that worked with Bill Watterson, they actually owned the rights to Calvin and Hobbes. But the problem, and this is this thing about ideas, if you have a great idea and it's expressed through you and it is you, and remember, Calvin and Hobbes is Bill Watterson. Calvin thinks about the stuff that Bill thinks about. The cartooning skill is Bill's skill to draw, the quality that he draws. Because not all comic books are like this. Some comic books can be replaced by other people if the author leaves or passes away. And this has happened a lot. But Bill Watterson, Calvin, when we said earlier that Calvin writes itself, it's because Bill understands that character. Even though Universal Press Syndicate owned the IP for Calvin and Hobbes, the initial relationship, they knew that if they did not get sign off from Bill Watterson and he walked away, that comic strip was done. Calvin and Hobbes was done. This is not the case for every other comic strip. I could probably write Garfield, to be honest, at this point. If you give me an illustrator, I can write those 3-panel jokes. I can make fat cat jokes, okay? Jim Davis and Paul Zink, if you're listening, I will do Garfield, just to make a point. Having said that, Universal Press owned the IP for Calvin and Hobbes. They could have licensed it for dolls, which was offered, licensed it for calendars. They tried, licensed it for gloves, underwear, Calvin and Hobbes underwear. Think about how those would fly off the shelves for kids, right? None of it. Bill Watterson said this about licensing. The comic book world is much more fragile than most people realize. Wonderful, lifelike characters are easily corrupted and cheapened by having them appear on every drugstore shelf and rack. So this is where the art versus money making comes into play. But for Calvin and Hobbes, what I will say is this. So I mentioned earlier that the licensing obviously brings cooks into the kitchen. It brings in people that want to make money off the merch. They're going to say, hey, you should do a comic book like this so we can sell this merch. Bill Watterson, as you could probably tell at this point, not cool with that. But Hobbes, the character of Hobbes is actually very interesting. And this is what really triggered Bill about the licensing process. One of the biggest offered up merchandises was a Hobbes tiger stuffy doll. Somebody actually sent Bill a sample, and this might be apocryphal, but he apparently took the box and burnt them in his backyard. And this is why he was so offended by Hobbes, the doll, being sold as merch. And it can get you into his mind a bit. He goes, the idea of Hobbes as a doll is especially nauseous because the intrigue of Hobbes is that he may or may not be a real tiger. The strip deliberately sets up two versions of reality without committing itself to either one. If I'm not going to answer the question of who or what Hobbes is, I'm certainly not going to let some stuffed manufacturer answer it. It makes no sense to allow someone to make Hobbes into a stuffed toy for real and deprive the strip of its element of magic. So I listen to that and I totally agree with that. So there's the art side of me being like, Bill, you're right, man. You're 100% right. The opposite of the Bill argument is that later in the book, Lee Salem, the syndicate person who worked with Bill, is like, man, I'd be on a beach right now. I would be on a beach cooking if he was able to license. Come talk about $500 million worth of licensing. And the syndicate probably would have got a couple $100 million out of that. But Bill was having none of it. Here's Bill's official cook. Here's Bill's official quote on Too Many Cooks in the Kitchen. Once a lot of money and jobs are riding on the status quo, it gets harder to push the extremes and experiment with the strip. Try to go in new directions. Characters lose their believability as they start endorsing major companies and lend their faces to bed sheets and boxer shorts. I mean, these are credible arguments, and you're probably, the commercialization of things. I mean, Disney admittedly makes great films, but the merchandising is insane, right? And you can see it losing its soul a bit. I didn't see what Bill had to say about Disney, but I'm sure he doesn't feel great about that. So speaking about Disney, or speaking of films, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas both reached out to Bill Watterson. Bill Watterson was invited to George Lucas's Skywalker Ranch. Didn't go. When he was offered to speak to Steven Spielberg, Bill Watterson said this: "Why would I want to talk to Steven Spielberg? I make comic strips. I don't do movies." This is the J.D. Salinger reputation for Bill Watterson, right? Like this recluse author. And it kind of builds his legend, but a part of me is kind of sad. It's like, man, you're doing some great stuff. Think about all these other awesome avenues you should have gone. Maybe that's not what he wanted. Clearly, it wasn't what he's wanted. We'll discuss it later in this podcast in the awards section. Maybe people just want what they want. You know when they say the heart just wants what the heart wants? Bill Watterson's heart, which was crafted to become a tool for this idea of Calvin and Hobbes, that Jen McKenna idea. That's not what he wanted. He wanted to just draw. So the licensing battle came to a head in 1991. So this is 6 years into the relationship with Universal Press Syndicate and Bill Watterson. They want to license stuff. For 6 years, Bill was actually mentioning these artistic arguments in the comic strip itself. Like there are comic strips of Calvin and Hobbes talking about the value of art. Should it be desecrated with commercialism? People were kind of understanding. A lot of fans were understanding that this was like a subtweet towards Universal Press Syndicate. In 1991, 6 years basically of arguing about whether to license anything, merch, Universal Press Syndicate just folded. They're like, Bill owns this IP. This is what's crazy. They own the IP, but Bill actually did. Because without Bill, there is no Calvin and Hobbes. They gave him back the ownership of Calvin and Hobbes, the intellectual property. Crazy. Think about that. They owned it. This thing's worth $500 million in merch. But they knew that Bill Watterson, without him, there was no Calvin and Hobbes. They gave it back to him. And not only did they give it back to him, he had so much negotiating leverage. He negotiated for 2 sabbaticals. He's like, you guys will keep getting these strips in newspapers, but I also want to take 2 sabbaticals, 9-month-long sabbaticals. Literally just took 9 months off, twice, between 1991 and 1995 when he did his last strip. And what's crazy is that this is what Nevin Martell, the author of the book I'm referencing, said about sabbaticals. To put this into perspective, most cartoonists don't ever get to take a vacation from the readers. If they want to take time off, they have to draw enough strips in advance to cover the absence so that readers will always have a new strip every day. Artists don't just put their strips in reruns for a couple of weeks every August so they can sit on a beach somewhere. They always had to be producing. The absolute exceptions were the best of the best. Gary Trudeau for Doonesbury, Gary Larson for The Far Side, or in this case, Bill Watterson for Calvin and Hobbes. And I think this goes back. I want to keep talking about that Jed quote. You become a tool for the idea. The world crafts you into the tool for what you wanted. Bill Watterson was getting so burnt out. He had so become the tool for this idea, the vessel for this idea for him, he needed the sabbaticals. His wife, Melissa, during this time, were living in Santa Fe. And that's just what they were doing. They took time off. So the first sabbatical is actually in 1990. Later one, I think, is 1994. But around this time, Universal Press Syndicate, you, as the listener, you can probably also tell, Bill Watterson's just a different cat. He marches to his own beat. They kind of knew this relationship was over, or knew that Bill would walk away, and that the most that they would get, and not to say it was nothing, the most that they would get was the split from syndicating Calvin and Hobbes in those newspapers, and splits from the book, which sold 50 million copies. So like they still made some cheddar, just not that 500 million cheddar from this random merch swag, right? So before we get to the awards sections, let me talk a bit about the theme I wanted to talk about, was the Jed McKenna. I know I keep saying it, but I love this idea so much that you become what you ask for, right? So let me re-quote what I said that Jed McKenna wrote about Francis Ford Coppola. Be careful what you wish for, not because you'll get it, but because you'll be turned into the thing that can get it. It's not a process where you ask for something and it magically appears. It's a process that breaks you down and rebuilds you into the right tool for the job. Let me continue, actually. I didn't even mention this part from Jed's essay. I mentioned the peculiar inability of some artists to understand their own creations at the highest levels at which they can be interpreted, which applies to Orwell, Coppola, Shakespeare, and many others. It's weird about the co-creative partnership that art can transcend the artist. The creation is the point, not the creator. Sometimes we're just a partner and sometimes we're just a tool. What was Jesus but God's tool? Muhammad but Allah's tool? Arjuna but Krishna's tool? The universe has no other hands but ours. So Bill Watterson was the tool for Calvin and Hobbes. He was the vessel to bring this ideal into the world, and it burnt him. It burnt him out, and he walked away. The last comic strip was on December 31st, 1995. It's a panel, I think it's a 6-panel strip of Calvin and Hobbes tobogganing. In his Ohio youth, Bill Watterson tobogganed a lot. The theme of tobogganing comes up a lot in the comic Calvin and Hobbes strips. The last one is of them tobogganing. And the last thing they say as they slide down the hill is, "Let's go exploring." It's the last thing Bill Watterson ever put onto paper for Calvin and Hobbes. Walked away. It's been 28 years. And that was a vessel. He was so burnt out. So I'm going to quote some things and ideas of how burnt out he got. So this is an article from American Conservative. So Bill's actually coming out now with an adult themed, I think, animated book set. By the time this podcast comes out, it might have already been released, but that's what he's been working on. Mostly recluse, though, for 30 years, 3 decades. But this is a quote from Watterson. He goes, work and home were so intermingled that I had no refuge from the strip when I needed a break. Day or night, the work was always right there, and the book publishing schedule was as relentless as the newspaper deadlines. Having certain perfectionist and maniacal tendencies, I was consumed by Calvin and Hobbes. So I was talking 12 hours a day just on the comic strip. I didn't even mention the book. Organizing the strips in the right placement in the book. That's what he was doing. He had 11 books, so 50 million copies. So another excerpt from the American Conservative. By Watterson's own admission, he cannot accurately recall a whole decade of his life because of his quote-unquote Ahab-like obsession with his work. Ahab from Moby Dick, obsessed with getting the whale. This is what Bill Watterson continues to quote. The intensity of pushing the writing and drawing as far as my skill allowed was the whole point of doing it. I eliminated pretty much everything from my life that wasn't the strip. My approach was probably too crazy to sustain for a lifetime, but it let me draw the exact strip that I wanted while it lasted. So that's crazy, right? Just think about that. It's like he became the tool for Calvin and Hobbes, and he burnt himself. Let's call it, how far do you want to take this analogy? He was a, I don't know, sculpt. It was the nail. What is that thing you do with the nail? You know, those images you got the hammer and you hit the Sharpie thing into the rock. You're sculpting the rock. People, who's a sculptor? The Sharpie thing into the rock. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So he made that dull, right? Or it's like a chef with a knife. He dulled the knife. He was a tool. He took it so far. He broke the tool. He was the tool and he broke it himself. So that's where we are. That's the wildest, or one of my favorite, I wouldn't call it wildest, it's just an amazing example, case study of that Jed McKenna idea that people become like, we become vessels. We become the tool. The world shapes us into the tool that we believe as an idea that we want to create, right? So be careful what it is you aspire to. Be careful what it is that you choose as your life's work or your heroes, because you will be shaped into that tool. And I think that's the last thing I'll say about that before we get into the awards section. All right, people, the awards section of Calvin and Hobbes by Bill Watterson. So for the listeners, the awards section is a straight ripoff from the Rewatchables podcast from The Ringer, Bill Simmons' company. They just kind of give random awards. I've copied some of their awards and I've added a couple of my own. So the first award I want to give out is for Apex Mountain. The idea of what part of the Calvin and Hobbes story, Bill Watterson bringing the idea of Calvin and Hobbes to real life. What was the apex from that story and that's been reached? I'd say it's the comic book, newspaper comics is the apex. So when Bill Watterson retired in 1995, Gary Larson's The Far Side also ended. So did Burke Breathard's Outland. And also by the late 90s, early 2000s, the internet comes, a newspaper industry gets destroyed, the newspaper comics kind of ended. The golden age, as described by Nevin Martel, the author of the book I'm referencing. So I'd say that's a peak. And there's a great quote here from Mike Peters, the co-creator or the creator of the Mother Goose and Grimm. He has this is what he says about Bill Watterson. And Bill Watterson obviously was part of this golden age, and some might say he was the peak. Some argue that Calvin and Hobbes is the best of the best. So here's what Mike Peters says about Bill Watterson. After watching Jack Nicklaus, not Nicholson, not the Hollywood playboy that just piping like crazy. We're talking about Jack Nicklaus, golf legend, the Golden Bear. So let me restart the Mike Peters quote again. After watching Jack Nicklaus win the 1965 Masters, Bobby Jones said, "Nicklaus played a game with which I am not familiar." Jones meant that Nicklaus playing was so good that he was playing a different game. And that's what Watterson was doing. Calvin and Hobbes was so deep, funny, and true, and it hit with so many of us who haven't left our childhoods. So Apex Mountain is newspaper comic strips. It was never as good again. What aged badly? So I tweeted about Calvin and Hobbes a couple months ago, and Emmett Shear, who was co-founder of Twitch, I believe, he had a very good reply to my tweet. I was talking about how Bill Watterson is such a pure artist. He wouldn't license his material, wouldn't make a film. But Emmett brought up the point that, well, here's the negative of that. The next generation aren't really finding out about Calvin and Hobbes. Like, granted, I'm buying Calvin and Hobbes for my son, but that's not the best distribution channel to find him. Like, unfortunately, a lot of kids now, well, not unfortunately, I say unfortunately in the sense of I don't think the quality is as good, but my son discovered media properties from YouTube, right? Like Blippi, Cocomelon. If you're a parent and you hear those words, you're probably getting PTSD right now. But those are the media properties and the IP that kids learn about because it's through YouTube or through Netflix for a Peppa Pig. By refusing to license and keeping Calvin and Hobbes in the medium of the comic strip only, not doing film, not doing shorts, the next generation may be deprived from what is one of the best. I opened this podcast with the idea that Bill Watterson said, the reason Calvin and Hobbes still resonates is because I didn't hoard it out. I didn't sell it out. But there's something to be said for, there are a lot of people that will never hear about Calvin and Hobbes because it's just not in the mediums of the year 2023. And I think there's credence to that. So I think something that's aged badly is the idea that Bill Watterson can just leave it the way it is. It is right. But I think, sadly, a lot of people will not, a lot of the next generation, a lot of young people won't get the joys of Calvin and Hobbes because it was the apex. It's like Mike Peters said, Calvin and Hobbes was so deep, funny, and true. Watterson was playing a different game. funniest thing that happened with Calvin and Hobbes. Here's what I think was pretty funny. A lot of people that do know about Calvin and Hobbes, we're talking about multimedia, is that sticker, that decal that's on a lot of pickup trucks or SUVs or on the back of cars of Calvin peeing. We all know from Bill Watterson's story, he didn't license that. He didn't green light that. Somebody took a cartoon image of Calvin filling a water balloon with water and then turned it to make it look like he was taking a piss. And now that's like today, the most popular version that you probably see of Calvin, which is out of Bill Watterson's control, which probably goes back to the previous point I made about aging badly. The media that people know about it is something that he hates. He probably would have made $500 million just from that decal. But here's what he said, kind of jokingly. Bill Watterson said, I clearly miscalculated how popular it would be to show Calvin urinating on a Ford logo. So that's him referencing the Calvin peeing decal, which has become very famous. It kind of reminds me of Michael Jordan. I grew up, own all his shoes, huge Chicago Bulls fan. I think he's great as ever. But like the younger generation, if you're born in the late 90s, early 2000s, the most you'll know Michael Jordan is probably from the crying Michael Jordan meme. Like Michael Jordan went to the Hall of Fame, cried when he was talking about his family, and like it turned into the crying Michael Jordan meme. So like that's a similar thing with this Calvin and Hobbes art decal. Is like most young people probably know that Calvin peeing thing, which Bill Watterson didn't even do. So Bill, like let's consider other mediums. So what was a notable prediction that paid out well? You know what? I'm contradicting myself. I'm contradicting myself because I'm saying the notable prediction is the other side of the coin of what aged badly. So I'm going to revisit what he said, ending it at 10 years, because whether he was worn out or he had said everything he needed to say, and it's also as a piece of art. If you do know about Calvin and Hobbes, you're probably very satisfied with the arc it went through. So this isn't necessarily contradicting what I said before. It is sad that younger generations aren't exposed to a ton of Bill Watterson. But the piece of art itself has aged extremely well in the sense of, this is it. There's a 10-year run. There were no bad strips. So it reminds me of Seinfeld. Jerry Seinfeld was offered $110 million in the late 90s to do the 10th season of Seinfeld. But he agreed that the 9th season would be the last one with NBC. Larry David, as co-creator, had left after the 6th season. So Seinfeld did seasons 7, 8, and 9, at least 8, 9 by himself. He actually also mentioned that he was completely burnt out by doing that. But here's what Jerry Seinfeld said about ending the show at 9 seasons and not doing 10. The love affair between the people that were making the show and the audience was so intense. It was so white hot. I had to respect that. And I could not get to the point where it starts to age and wither. And it doesn't take long for something to age and wither. For example, you could see a comedian 1 hour and 10 minutes and you'll love him. So the comedian has an hour and 10 minute show. But at an hour and 30 minutes, so 20 minutes longer, you start thinking, I wish this guy would be done. The extra 20 minutes leaves you feeling the comedy set totally different. It's a small amount of too much that can negatively influence your perception. Too much cake, this first slice, delicious. I had another half slice, not so great. Too much of anything will change your perception. So Bill Watterson and Seinfeld were both influenced and both fans of the Beatles, who ran for 9 years. So there is something to be said about creating this body of art. Quentin Tarantino is the same. He's done it 10 movies. He wants to make 10 films. It's the idea of, historically, this is Quentin's view. He's like, every director, their filmography is what defines them, their body of work. He only wanted hitters. He wanted in 100 years people to look back and be like, wow, Quentin Tarantino only did hitters. So I guess for this award of notable predictions, which feels contradictory to what I said about age badly, I don't think it is. Listen, it's my podcast. It's my word section. I can do whatever I want. But I think Bill Watterson may be capping it at 10 years, saying I've said all I had to say. Maybe in 100 years or 200 years, if you care about those things, the entire body of work will actually stand the test of time. And maybe now this knee-jerk reaction I'm having of, oh, they're not appealing to the TikTok generation, it'll be moot. We'll see. We'll see in 100 years. With advances in health technology, we'll all be here. We'll all see it, hopefully. So what is the biggest what if? For me, it's the film. This is similar to the last two topics. Can you make a film? So this is what Bill Watterson said about making Calvin and Hobbes, the film. He thought that Calvin and Hobbes was meant for the medium of comic strips. It's like those 3 panels. That's Calvin and Hobbes. Later in life, he might have come around a bit, because this is what he said long after. He said, for all my admiration of the art, I really can't decide if I ever want to see Calvin and Hobbes animated. I know I'd enjoy working with the visual opportunities animations offer, but you change the world you created when you change the medium in which it is presented. Another more personal reservation I have is that animation by necessity is a team sport, and the fewer people with input in my work, the better I like it. Later in the same interview, Watterson said, I'm reserving judgment on animation. So maybe he will. But, he turned down Spielberg, turned down Lucas. What's interesting is one of the biggest fans, or a very big fan of Calvin and Hobbes, is Brad Bird. Brad Bird is a Pixar director of Ratatouille and The Incredibles. This is what Brad Bird said about Bill Watterson. If Earth suddenly had to be evacuated and I was limited to grabbing the 10 best people to save, Watterson would definitely be in there. There's a point where you stop rating people. You just rate them among the best. Can I say that Mozart is better than the Beatles? I can't. I can just say that they both have gone above the cloud layer and are up there near the sun. They are both on the short list of things that are essential. Watterson is essential. So Brad Bird says this about Watterson's drawing and why he thinks it would be great as an animated film. And if anybody can handle it, it's Pixar, right? So Brad Bird says, the spaceman spiff sequences, so this is like when Bill Watterson drew Calvin as the spaceman character, those scenes feel like movies. People oftentimes illustrate a kid's imagination with a kid's drawings, but the drawings are not the imagination. Watterson was really good about that because the drawings were as real as reality. A kid's imagination of something that might be goofy or fantastic is vivid. Their ability to put it down on paper might be limited, but that's not their imagination. When Calvin would imagine something, it was more like a really big budget movie. So there you go. The biggest what if, Calvin and Hobbes film. Never say never. The next award, what is the biggest winner? People that love Calvin and Hobbes are the biggest winner. Me, fan. I don't know if people know about Calvin Ball. There are no rules. It's just a game. You literally just invent it. It's called Calvin Ball. Do whatever you want. There are no rules. You make them up. Nevin Martell has a great excerpt from his book. He writes, the true measure of an art intended for children is whether it resonates on a deeper level when you interpret it as an adult. J.R.R. Tolkien books, Walt Disney's movies, and the soundtrack to Yellow Submarine all took on a new life when I crossed the threshold from youth into relative maturity, and so did Calvin and Hobbes. So the winner here then is lifelong fans of Calvin and Hobbes, because it hits different through ages. The Simpsons is like this actually for me also. So I share this with my son now. He loves the Calvin cartoons about cars. My son's obsessed with cars. There's a Calvin comic that we just go to over and over and over again. Calvin's asking his mom, can I drive? She says no. Calvin says, can I just do the steering wheel? You do the pedals. She says no. And then Calvin ends the comic by saying, I can never do anything. My son loses his mind every time he reads it. We've probably read it 100 times. So I'll say the winner is fans, lifelong fans of Calvin and Hobbes. The biggest loser by far is Universal Press Syndicate. $500 million in merch foregone. So Lee Salem, the Universal Press Syndicate person that worked with Bill, I mean, he joked, but he said this: if Bill had let us just license Calvin and Hobbes, he's referring to Nevin Martell, the writer of the book that I referenced, you wouldn't be talking to me today. You'd be tracking me down on a beach in the Bahamas. So a lot of people could have had cheddar. Are there any good substitutes? For me, the only comic on even a similar plane is The Far Side, Gary Larson. Single panel, hilarious comic strips. This is what Bill Watterson says about The Far Side. I really like the lunacy of The Far Side. I do enjoy Larson's stuff. The Far Side is a great strip. I laugh out loud at the strip more than any other. So I really like Gary Larson's Far Side. Really good. Probably have to cover it in a future episode. All right, here. So the last part is what are the biggest lessons from Calvin and Hobbes about how to bring an idea into real life? I've already said it ad nauseum. The first big lesson for me is you become a vessel, the Jed McKenna idea, the Francis Ford Coppola and Apocalypse Now. Be very careful about what it is you've convinced yourself you want to do, because the universe will turn you into a tool to do that. And as Jed wrote, sometimes the art becomes bigger than the artist. That's actually kind of Bill Watterson's perspective. He hates being interviewed, refused to be interviewed for the book that Nevin Martell wrote, actually turned down multiple interviews. There's like a Washington Post reporter once in the early 2000s, flew down to Ohio where Bill Watterson lived, gave a message to his parents. Is like, I'm not leaving Ohio until Bill interviews. I'll just stay here in a hotel. And after a few days, the reporter's editor is like, okay, just leave. Like, he's never coming. So recluse, J.D. Salinger style. But you will become a vessel. The art may become bigger than the artist. This is the Jed McKenna idea. So that's my first lesson. The second lesson is the idea of shutting it down. It's like what Jerry Seinfeld said. Some ideas run their course. Jerry Seinfeld ended after 9 years, the show Seinfeld. Bill Watterson ended Calvin and Hobbes after 10 years, never touched it again. He didn't let it live on in some zombie form with a team of comic strip writers drawing it and just using his IP. He didn't allow that. That's kind of what's happening with Star Wars since it's been sold to Disney. Some of the projects are decent, kind of, but most of it's kind of shit. I like The Mandalorian. They canceled that. Anyways, some things need to end, right? And not everything needs to be milked. On a related note, though, is the last lesson I'll say is the idea of art for art's sake. And my takeaway is this: just do you. If you want to do licensing, go ahead, do licensing, right? If you want to, quote unquote, ruin the sanctity of your art because you want to bring money into it, that's your right. And I think Bill Watterson goes pretty hard at people that do that, but I think it's unfair because everybody should just be able to express their own taste. And you don't have to be the hoity. I mean, you can be the hoity-toity, oh, I'm all about the art guy, but I don't think that either one's right or wrong. That's what I say about expressing ideas. Just do what feels right to you. If you are okay with having money in the game, sure, do you. I'm not going to judge you. If you're Bill Watterson's view, do you. And like, here's what Charles Schultz, who wrote the foreword to the comic book collection I showed you, the Calvin and Hobbes one, he also had thoughts, though, about Watterson's hatred of licensing and Watterson's criticism about licensing. So this is from a LA Book Review article I read for this podcast. This is what Schultz said. One day, one company wanted to make these little rubber dolls of Peanuts characters. Well, what was wrong with that? Those were cute. And I suppose Bill Watterson came along later with his stand against licensing, which is really ridiculous. But I don't know Bill. I'm sure his life is different than mine. And he didn't have 5 kids to support and a lot of other things like that. So, you know, the contra, so this is my perspective, the contra to Bill Watterson's perspective is, yeah, like guys like Jim Davis with Garfield and Charles Schultz with Peanuts, they were supporting a lot of people with their work. So like that's the contra to Calvin and Hobbes. Like I joked about Lee Salem, the Universal Press Syndicate guy, saying like, you'd find me an island. It's the same deal, right? It's like Bill Watterson could have made a lot of people's lives. And I'm not critiquing him for that, but I don't think it's necessarily fair for him to critique people that did do that. This is what Charles Schultz said about cartooning. Cartooning is what I've always wanted to do with my life. And he's criticizing Bill Watterson taking sabbaticals. He's saying taking time off would be unfair to newspapers, to the syndicate, and the syndicate salespeople. So Charles Schultz never took big time off, not like these 2 9-month chunks that Bill Watterson took. So those are, you know, opposite perspectives. I think both have credence. Jim Davis, I didn't quote him here, but Jim Davis also said that even though he has this licensing empire, he created Paws Inc. for Garfield. He's like, the Garfield was the art for me. He's like, it still came first. And he said that actually creating a lot of merchandise actually informed my creation or some of the comic strips. So there's back and forth. those are the big lessons. And yeah, that's my episode on Calvin and Hobbes. I love it. Episode 4. The next episode I'm doing is about La Sagrada Familia, Antoni Gaudi, the great architect, sculptor, artist. But I'm doing that because it's very similar to Calvin and Hobbes in the sense that Gaudi became a tool for the Sagrada Familia. He had decided that's what he wanted to do. He spent 40 years doing it until his tragic death. I'll be talking more about that next episode, but I wanted to tease it. And again, I love doing this. Episode 4 is down. We've done iPhone, Trader Joe's brand, Lululemon, yoga pants, and Calvin and Hobbes, a comic strip. I'm very online. I don't mind selling. So I'm going to ask, like, if you've enjoyed any of these episodes, please share, drop them in your Slacks, drop them in your WhatsApps, leave me a review. Give me a 1-star review. I don't care. Actually, I do care. But if it's deserved, then sure, I'll take it. But leave me a review, share it. And thank you so much for supporting this podcast. I'm really enjoying doing it. And we got a lot more bangers coming. Trung out.